Tonight begins with a line that Western leaders had hoped would never be crossed. Not whispered through back channels, not hinted at in diplomatic language, but published openly, deliberately, and without restraint. An ultimatum from Moscow that invoked Russia's nuclear doctrine in plain sight and demanded Ukraine's complete surrender or face what the Kremlin described as irreversible consequences. In a single move, Vladimir Putin erased the last remaining illusion that nuclear escalation was still off the table. This was not rhetoric designed for negotiation. It was coercion, stripped bare. Intelligence officials confirm that this ultimatum was not preceded by months of diplomatic signaling or confidence-building gestures. It arrived as a finished product, already weaponized, already intended to intimidate. The language alone alarmed U.S. diplomats and NATO strategists because it did something unprecedented in this war. It explicitly tied territorial demands to nuclear consequences, collapsing the space between conventional warfare and existential threat. What made this moment even more destabilizing was the timing. For months, Putin's escalation pattern had followed a recognizable rhythm. Hostile, yes, but methodical. Predictable enough for intelligence agencies to anticipate and prepare. That rhythm suddenly vanished. Mobile launch platforms were quietly repositioned. Strategic command facilities switched to encrypted communication modes. Early warning radar networks were activated. Diplomatic personnel were abruptly withdrawn, then silence. And whenever Putin goes silent, history tells us it means something loud is coming. Earlier today, U.S. intelligence detected what they described as unprecedented nuclear signaling operations, including the movement of platforms capable of carrying tactical nuclear warheads that had remained stationary for over 18 months. These assets are not moved casually. They are activated only when Moscow wants to send a message that cannot be misunderstood. Whether this was preparation, coercion, or deliberate escalation was unclear. What was clear is that Russia had shifted its strategic posture. When a nuclear-armed state shifts its posture without explanation, the Pentagon pays attention. And when Putin followed that movement with a public ultimatum, the message was unmistakable. He was testing resolve. He was daring hesitation. And in doing so, he crossed the threshold the West had worked desperately to preserve. Ultimatums are meant to be read. Signals are meant to be noticed. And beneath the language of Moscow's demand, intelligence agencies were tracking a pattern that made the threat feel materially different from previous bluster. This was not just messaging for domestic audiences or psychological pressure aimed at Kyiv. It was a synchronized package of words and movements designed to compress decision-making time for everyone else. Within hours of the ultimatum, analysts confirmed changes across Russia's strategic command posture. Units tied to nuclear-capable forces shifted readiness levels. Communications moved to hardened channels. Exercises that had been dormant reappeared on schedules under new labels. None of this, on its own, proves intent to use nuclear weapons. Together, however, it constitutes what strategists call coercive signaling, actions calibrated to raise risk without pulling the final trigger. For Vladimir Putin, this method is familiar. He has long relied on ambiguity as leverage, pushing adversaries to imagine worst-case outcomes and then moderating just enough to extract concessions. The difference now is proximity. Earlier nuclear references sat at the edges of speeches framed as abstract doctrine. This ultimatum pulled them into the center, tying nuclear consequences directly to a concrete demand, surrender territory, or face escalation. Inside NATO, the reaction was immediate and serious. Emergency consultations were convened not to craft statements, but to assess timelines. When signaling accelerates, time becomes the most valuable resource. Leaders needed to know whether this was a bluff designed to fracture unity or the opening phase of a risk ladder that could climb faster than diplomacy can keep up. What made the situation more volatile was the absence of an off-ramp in the ultimatum itself. There were no confidence-building measures, no phased proposals, no room for interpretation. That rigidity is intentional. It forces responses rather than dialogue. And when responses are forced, miscalculation becomes more likely. This is why analysts are treating this moment as a structural shift, not another spike in rhetoric. The combination of explicit nuclear language and observable readiness alters how every subsequent move is interpreted. From this point forward, even routine military activity carries added weight. The margin for error narrows, and the cost of misunderstanding rises. To grasp why Western intelligence is treating this moment as categorically different, you have to understand how nuclear threats usually function. Most are vague by design. They rely on implication, not instruction. They hint at consequences without specifying triggers. That ambiguity creates space for diplomacy and de-escalation. What Moscow issued this time did the opposite. It collapsed ambiguity. The ultimatum did not speak in generalities about defending Russian sovereignty or responding to existential danger. It defined a condition and paired it with consequence. Ukraine must accept Moscow's terms, or Russia reserves the right to escalate using its full spectrum of capabilities. That phrasing matters. It shifts nuclear weapons from a background deterrent into a foreground instrument of coercion. In strategic terms, that is a red flag. Western analysts also noted what was missing. There was no reference to international mediation, no mention of phased talks, no acknowledgement of allied security concerns. Those omissions suggest the message was not crafted for compromise. It was crafted to force a reaction. And forcing reactions is dangerous because it accelerates decision cycles on all sides. Inside Kyiv, officials read the ultimatum as an attempt to bypass Ukraine entirely and speak over its head directly to NATO capitals. The logic is clear. If Moscow can convince Western governments that continued support risks nuclear escalation, pressure on Ukraine intensifies from the outside. It is a strategy aimed less at the battlefield and more at political will. That strategy has a history. During the Cold War, nuclear signaling was often used to freeze conflicts on favorable terms. The difference now is that the signaling is coming from a conventional war already underway, with active combat and shifting front lines. That overlap increases risk dramatically. When conventional losses mount, incentives to escalate rhetorically and potentially materially grow. This is why intelligence agencies are not asking whether Putin wants nuclear war. They are asking whether he is willing to raise the risk of one to change the outcome of a conventional conflict. Those are not the same question. And history shows that misjudging that distinction is how crises spiral. From this point on, every response carries weight. Every pause is interpreted, and every misstep compounds. The ultimatum was not just a threat. It was a test of resolve, clarity, and restraint all at once. Once the ultimatum landed, the war stopped being measured only in kilometers and casualties. It started being measured in hours. Emergency calls lit up secure lines across Washington, Brussels, Berlin, London, and Paris. This was not about crafting a statement or managing headlines. It was about risk management under compression, the kind of moment when leaders are forced to decide how much uncertainty they are willing to tolerate. The first question was brutally practical: credibility. Intelligence chiefs briefed that nuclear signaling only works if the adversary believes escalation is plausible. The movements observed were real. The posture changes were documented, but credibility cuts both ways. Overuse of nuclear threats can dull their impact, especially if previous red lines were crossed without consequence. The challenge for Western leaders was determining whether this threat represented escalation fatigue or escalation intent. The second question was unity. Moscow's strategy has long relied on exploiting hesitation and divergence among allies. An ultimatum framed in nuclear terms is designed to amplify those cracks. Some governments worry about escalation risk above all else. Others prioritize deterrence and credibility. When time is short, those differences become sharper. The Kremlin understands that even a temporary delay, even a single dissenting voice, can shift the balance of pressure. Behind closed doors, military planners began gaming out responses, not just to words, but to possible follow-on actions. What if Russia conducted a demonstrative test? What if it used a nuclear-capable platform in a conventional strike? What if it paired further signaling with battlefield escalation? None of these scenarios require actual nuclear use to cause panic. The threat alone can reshape policy. This is where the situation becomes most dangerous. When leaders are forced to make high-stakes decisions quickly, misinterpretation becomes more likely. Signals intended as deterrence can be read as preparation. Restraint can be read as weakness. And the absence of clear off-ramps increases the chance that everyone moves forward at once, assuming the other side will blink. The ultimatum did what it was designed to do. It accelerated the clock, it narrowed options, and it shifted the burden of choice outward, away from Moscow and onto those trying to prevent catastrophe while sustaining support for a country under attack. From here, every move is amplified and every mistake costs more. At this stage, analysts stopped asking whether the ultimatum was designed to be accepted. They started asking whether it was designed to be survived. Nuclear brinkmanship is not always about use. More often, it is about forcing the other side into a narrower corridor where every option feels bad and delay feels dangerous. That is the space Moscow was trying to create. From a strategic standpoint, the ultimatum served three overlapping purposes. First, it aimed to freeze momentum on the battlefield by injecting existential risk into every Western calculation. Military aid packages that once moved on predictable schedules suddenly required higher-level review. Long-planned deliveries became politically sensitive overnight. Even temporary hesitation buys time, and time is currency in a grinding war. Second, it tested alliance psychology. The Kremlin understands that alliances are strongest when threats are conventional and weakest when stakes become abstract and catastrophic. Nuclear language pushes debates out of military planning rooms and into political ones, where public fear, electoral pressure, and media narratives play a larger role. The goal is not to split NATO permanently, but to slow it just enough to regain leverage. Third, the ultimatum reasserted control over escalation. By setting the terms publicly, Moscow attempted to reclaim the initiative, signaling that it, not Kyiv, not Washington, would define the next rung on the ladder. In coercive diplomacy, defining the ladder matters as much as climbing it. If you convince the other side that only you are willing to take the next step, you gain psychological advantage even without moving. What makes this dangerous is that brinkmanship relies on mutual assumptions about restraint. Each side believes the other will stop short of disaster, but assumptions are fragile, especially under stress. As conventional setbacks accumulate, leaders may lean more heavily on risk to compensate for loss of momentum. That does not mean catastrophe is inevitable. It means the margin for error shrinks. This is why seasoned analysts describe moments like this as unstable equilibrium. Nothing explodes immediately. Instead, pressure builds silently. Every decision is weighed against worst-case scenarios. And the longer that pressure persists, the more likely it is that a misread signal or an overconfident move tips the balance. At moments like this, the greatest danger is not intention, it is interpretation. Nuclear crises rarely erupt because leaders wake up seeking catastrophe. They erupt because signals are misread, timelines collide, and assumptions harden under pressure. As the ultimatum reverberated through Western capitals, intelligence agencies shifted focus from motive to mechanics, from what Moscow wants to how quickly events could spiral if something goes wrong. Military planners understand this problem well. When readiness levels rise, routine actions start to look threatening. Exercises resemble preparations. Movements resemble deployments. Silence resembles concealment. Each side begins interpreting the other through a lens of worst-case thinking. That cognitive shift is what makes escalation ladders dangerous. Once leaders believe the other side is preparing for the worst, restraint starts to feel irresponsible. This is why back channels suddenly matter more than speeches. Quiet military-to-military communications, deconfliction lines, and diplomatic intermediaries become critical safety valves. But those channels only work if both sides trust that restraint will be reciprocated. Ultimatums erode that trust. They frame the situation as binary, comply or escalate. Binary framing leaves little room for ambiguity, and ambiguity is often what prevents catastrophe. Inside NATO, officials were acutely aware of the historical echoes. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not come down to ideology. It came down to timing, perception, and a willingness to pause. The difference now is speed. Information travels faster. Decisions are made under tighter windows. Public pressure amplifies every move. What once unfolded over days can now unfold over hours. For Vladimir Putin, this environment is a gamble. Escalatory signaling can coerce, but it can also trap the signaler. Once you raise the stakes publicly, backing down carries reputational cost at home and abroad. That makes de-escalation harder, not easier. And if the other side responds firmly but cautiously, the original signal may lose effectiveness, forcing a choice between retreat and further escalation. This is the paradox of nuclear brinkmanship in a conventional war. The more you rely on risk to gain leverage, the more you expose yourself to outcomes you cannot fully control. The ultimatum has set forces in motion that no single actor now dominates. From here, stability depends less on power and more on judgment, restraint, and the ability to read signals accurately under stress. As the crisis stretches on, a dangerous psychological shift begins to take hold. Deterrence relies on calm calculation. Panic thrives on uncertainty. The ultimatum blurred that line, and once blurred, restoring clarity becomes exponentially harder. Leaders are now making decisions not just based on intelligence, but on how those decisions will be interpreted in real time by allies, adversaries, and their own publics. Inside NATO, messaging discipline became as important as troop movements. One reckless statement could harden positions or trigger market panic. One ambiguous comment could be read as weakness. The alliance's challenge was to project resolve without sounding escalatory, to reassure publics without normalizing nuclear language. That is a narrow rhetorical corridor, and history shows it is easy to misstep. Meanwhile, Moscow's domestic narrative tightened. State media framed the ultimatum as defensive necessity, portraying Russia as cornered by Western aggression. This framing matters because it limits the Kremlin's room to maneuver. When leaders sell existential stakes to their own population, compromise becomes politically costly. Deterrence works best when both sides retain face-saving exits. Ultimatums close those exits. There is also the market reaction. Energy prices twitched upward. Insurance premiums on shipping spiked. Defense stocks surged. These are early indicators of perceived risk, and they feed back into political pressure. Governments begin fielding calls from industries, unions, and voters asking whether escalation is imminent. That pressure can distort judgment, pushing leaders toward visible action simply to demonstrate control. This is the moment when misinterpretation becomes most likely. A routine NATO exercise could be read as preparation. A Russian test could be read as a rehearsal. Silence could be read as concealment. Each side watches the other for reassurance and finds only ambiguity. In such an environment, even restraint can look like indecision. The thin line between deterrence and panic is maintained by communication, credibility, and time. Ultimatums compress all three. They force posture changes before understanding catches up. And once panic enters the equation, rational risk assessment becomes harder to sustain. In crises like this, the most important elements are often the least visible. Not the threats, not the movements, but the off-ramps. Ways to slow the clock without signaling weakness. Ways to communicate restraint without conceding ground. Right now, those off-ramps exist, but they are narrow, fragile, and deliberately understated. Behind the scenes, intermediaries have begun quietly reactivating channels that rarely make headlines. Military deconfliction lines are being tested for reliability. Third-party governments are passing messages that are carefully worded to avoid commitment while probing intent. The goal is not to negotiate surrender or victory, but to restore ambiguity where the ultimatum tried to eliminate it. Ambiguity buys time. Time buys judgment. This is also where discipline matters. Western leaders understand that public theatrics can harden Moscow's position just as much as silence can invite miscalculation. That is why responses have emphasized unity, deterrence, and continuity rather than retaliation. The message is calibrated. Escalation will not coerce concessions, but neither will threats fracture resolve. At the same time, Kyiv is navigating its own impossible balance. It must reject surrender without appearing to dismiss escalation risk. It must signal determination while preserving international backing. That requires language that is firm but measured, defiant but not reckless. Every word is weighed, because in moments like this, words travel faster than missiles. What is striking is how much of the outcome now depends on patience. Not optimism, not bravado, but sustained restraint under pressure. History suggests that most nuclear crises de-escalate not through grand bargains, but through incremental cooling. Signals softened, timelines stretched, the tension redirected. None of that is dramatic. All of it is necessary. The ultimatum tried to force a binary choice. The response so far has been to resist that framing, to reintroduce complexity where simplicity was imposed. Whether that effort succeeds will determine whether this moment is remembered as the peak of a scare or the start of something far worse. This is the point where crises either burn out or burn forward, not because someone wins an argument, but because someone chooses not to push the next button. The ultimatum has already done its damage. It has injected nuclear language into a conventional war, compressed decision timelines, and forced every major power to confront worst-case scenarios. What happens next will determine whether this episode becomes a footnote in deterrence history or a turning point remembered for generations. For Vladimir Putin, the choice is no longer abstract. The signaling has been sent. The risk has been raised. Continuing down this path would require either escalation to maintain credibility or a carefully managed step back that preserves face. Both carry cost. One risks catastrophe. The other risks exposing the limits of coercion. Leaders who rely on brinkmanship often discover too late that retreat can be as dangerous politically as advance. For NATO and its partners, the test is equally severe. Deterrence must hold without panic. Unity must endure without overreaction. The alliance must show that nuclear threats do not buy concessions while avoiding moves that make escalation feel inevitable. That balance is difficult, but it is not impossible. History shows that restraint, when coordinated and credible, can drain coercive threats of their power. What makes this moment so consequential is not the presence of weapons, but the absence of certainty. No one can say with confidence how far Moscow is willing to go or how domestic pressures inside Russia will shape the next move. No one can fully predict how markets, publics, and political systems will respond if this tension drags on. In that uncertainty, judgment matters more than doctrine. If this crisis de-escalates, it will not be because of a single announcement or dramatic concession. It will be because signals soften, timelines stretch, and attention shifts quietly, incrementally, almost invisibly. And if it escalates, it will likely be remembered as a failure not of intelligence or power, but of restraint under pressure. This is why analysts are watching not just what leaders say, but what they don't do, which exercises are postponed, which statements are toned down, which channels remain open. In nuclear crises, survival often depends on the discipline to stop climbing the ladder when the view gets too dangerous. The ultimatum was a test. The response is still being written, and history, unforgiving and precise, will record who chose to slow the clock when speeding up felt easier.